So HDR stands for high dynamic range, and the whole idea is to bring out as much detail from an image as possible. Pull out detail from your highlights and from your shadows, thus expanding the dynamic range. So I have my settings in Lightroom set to identify the areas in the shadows and the highlights that have been overdone. So you can see the highlights in the sky here have been burned out, and there's a little bit here in the shadows, but more dramatically so here. You can see all of these spots that have been burned black. So the goal is to take whatever images we have captured out in the field and create the best looking image that we can in post-production. Sometimes though, you don't actually need to incorporate any fancy HDR techniques in order to get the results you need. This shot, for example, this was shot during sunset, but it was pointed away from the sun, so we don't have any stark contrast with our sky and our landscape. Whereas if we were to take a look at a shot that points more towards the sun, you can see we have got a lot more of the sky that's blown out because we have a lot more direct sunlight entering the frame. And even if we were to take our highlights slider and drop it all the way down, and it will take our exposure down too, just so you can see, these areas have been burned to white pixels. There is no recovering those pixels at all. Whereas in our other shot, if we were to take our highlight slider all the way down, you can see it recovered all of the pixel texture in the sky just fine. We can bring our shadows up as well. And even if that's not exactly the look we're going for, maybe we want to preserve our highlights here in our foreground, we can use a simple local adjustment to fix the highlights in the skies. And just use a linear adjustment here for adjusting the highlights. And now we've brought detail back into our sky without affecting our foreground elements. So this is an example of a shot where I probably won't use any HDR techniques. I can do everything I need to right here within Lightroom because I have all of the pixel information that I need. And even if, let's say, we really wanted to bring detail into this little tiny corner, I would probably just use a simple radial filter set to adjust shadows, and I would just have this localized adjustment work on the shadows for me instead of adjusting anything as a whole. So you can see right now that burned out area that was highlighted blue, just like this one, is now gone because we have brought our shadows back for the most part. That's being really nitpicky. I probably wouldn't spend the time adjusting these little tiny areas where there are blacked out pixels. I'd stick with this image just as is. In fact, I probably don't need the other 6 shots that were shot out in the field. Once I set my camera up to shoot a bracketed sequence, I just leave it on, especially during sunset or sunrise. But this initial shot gives me everything I need, so I don't need any of these other 6 images to get the dynamic range that I want to see. So HDR is not for every picture, and it takes a little bit of discernment to figure out when is a good moment to actually use multiple exposures and when is it best to just leave it as is and edit off of one. Let's go take a look at our other image over here though. So with this one, we've got a lot of burned out pixels in the sky, and in our bracketed sequence, this is our darkest exposure, set to roughly 1.5 stops, maybe even 2 stops, I honestly can't remember, below this exposure. I believe it was 2 stops underexposed. And we can recover a lot more detail in our highlights, whereas with this one, we really can't. So this is a great opportunity to deploy some high dynamic range techniques. Now what we can start off with is we can select all 7 of these images. We can go to Photo, Merge, And we can just start by seeing what Lightroom can create using its automatic high dynamic range formatting. Okay, so it is giving us a preview of what it created. It saved my settings from the last time I used HDR Lightroom. The to-go settings are for when you have more dramatic movement, say wind blowing in the trees and you have branches crisscrossing paths, and when you start blending the images, you'll start to see ghosts of different iterations of the same branch in the picture. Well, I know this was a windless day, and I know that there weren't any moving elements other than the clouds, so I'm going to set my deghosting amount to none, because I don't need it. Camera is set on a tripod. There's nothing that was moving within the frame that I want to be preserved. Okay, we'll go ahead and click merge. You can see that it has now created our HDR composite. So this is a digital negative of all of these 7 shots used in our bracketed sequence to create this high dynamic conversion. You can see it has already adjusted our Lightroom settings to what it thinks we want to see. I'm going to take my highlights all the way down just to see how much it can adjust things. Now, it really didn't do so bad. I set my exposure to -1.5. Highlights have dropped all the way down. One of the things that I don't like, though, let's take a look at our darkest exposure. If we take the highlights all the way down and just compare the two, there's a lot less color, and there's even a lot less detail in the sky comparatively. There's a lot more color, whereas in this one, there's just not quite as much. These highlights are still a bit burned out, even just barely so. It's not a bad shot. I wouldn't go so far to say that it did a great job of blending the two, but it's not bad. We can take our colors up and just see how well it looks, but overall this high dynamic range conversion in Lightroom probably isn't enough for what I'd want to see. Some shots it does great. Sometimes you don't need more than just the blending that Lightroom gives it, but this is a pretty stark contrast of a scene. We go straight from good detail on our shadows to good detail on our highlights, and they're kind of battling back and forth just because we're pointed straight towards the brightest part in the sky. So at this point, you can either continue to edit what you're seeing in Lightroom. I'm just going to reset this and give it my default import settings that I apply whenever the image is imported. We're going to play with our highlights, and we're just going to do a radial adjustment of dropping all those down. Let's bump up our dehaze. So overall, I'm still just not in love with how the high dynamic range conversion in Lightroom turned out. So at this point, realistically, what we're going to need to do is take it into Photoshop. I'm going to adjust the settings of this set really quick. I'm going to start out by giving myself essentially what I want to see in the final edit. So I'm going to copy these settings, and I'm going to just select all of the different exposures from the bracketed sequence. I'm going to paste the settings, and then with each of these I'm going to have them all selected and send them to Photoshop. Okay, we have successfully sent all of our images over to Photoshop. This is our main exposure. This is the neutral one, so we're looking at this shot right here. This one is our darkest exposure, the one that is darker by 2 full stops. We're going to click, drag, and hold to bring this image into our main composition. I'm going to align my layers so they line up. This is going to be our next darkest. I'm going to bring this one in as well. Make sure to align those layers. And I just know that it brings them in sequentially, so this is my next darkest, but it's close enough to our original that I'm not going to bring that one in. After that, we go to our ever increasingly brighter shots. Now this one's way too bright. Pretty much everything's blown out. But this is going to be roughly 2/3 of a stop brighter than our original. So I'm going to bring that one in as well and line them up. So essentially, we want the detail in this sky. We want a little bit more detail on our shadows, which we're going to get from our brighter shot. And then our mid-range darker one is going to be used to help us even things out. To start off though, we need to get a good selection of our sky. So I'm going to hit W for my quick selection tool, which I prefer over the magic wand almost all the time. I'm going to select our sky just by brushing across, and I'm going to go to the select and mask, and I like to set my view mode to overlay, which is essentially our quick mask mode. And you can see everything that is highlighted neon pink is our selection, but you can see it missed sections of our sky, and so I want to even that out really quick. I'm going to use the Refine Edge brush tool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit further. I have my hardness set to 0, and I'm going to set my brush size just wide enough so it's going to brush on both sides of this horizon line. You'll see when we brush through, it will clean up those edges between the sky and the actual land. You can see we went from these little patchy sections of white to everything is now neon pink, that is sky. So we're just going to quickly brush through our horizon line. My computer apparently thinks it needs to think while I'm brushing. I'm going to brush along, and ultimately we're going to select this entire section of the sky. Now, because we have these mountains in the distance, I'm going to drop my brush size just a little bit more and zoom in because I don't want it to deselect that horizon line. I want it to select this one just below, just because the exposure values are similar. I want the mountains in the far back to be a part of the sky selection. All we're doing is we're creating a clean selection of our sky so we can then mask in and out the other images that we brought into our composition. Go to select, save selection, save it as sky. Now, we could select our main sky layer, go to layer, mask, reveal selection, and it revealed and preserved our sky very nicely, but it just looks bad now on top of our brighter exposure. So we're going to move this up as our top layer for now. If we turn on our second darker exposure, you can see that it looks a lot better. It's essentially this exposure, but now we have much more detail in our highlights. However, our landscape foreground element is still too dark because we ultimately wanted to see this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on this layer. I'm going to go to Layer, Mask, Reveal All, and then I'm going to hit G for my gradient tool. And on the layer mask, white being my starting point and black being my ending point, I'm going to reveal the second darker layer just like this. So essentially what that's doing is we have revealed through a gradient mask. This is more or less what you would see if you were to use a slide-in graduated neutral density filter. That's essentially what we're doing here in post-processing, is we're darkening through a graduated filter everything from here all the way up to the sky. It's still a bit much, so I'm going to back this off by reducing the opacity to 70%. And now that looks a lot better. It's much more clean of a blend. If we turn on our sky, that looks a bit more realistic. Not quite, but closer. One of the things that's throwing me is when we dropped our highlights, this yellow section turned vibrant yellow. So one of the things I'm going to do now is I'm going to group this. I'm going to do a layer mask on top of a layer mask. So I've just got a keyboard shortcut for creating a reveal all layer mask. And now I'm going to do another gradient. And I'm going to zoom out because this is going to be a very big gradient. I want to reveal everything from here all the way down. So essentially we have this section here. It goes from white to just slightly grayish, and the reason why I did that is I just wanted to drop the opacity of, we'll turn off these other layers. So there's our sky with our full layer mask, and all we did is we just reduced the opacity. Now that's still not quite what I wanted, because I want more detail here. So I'm going to redraw the entire gradient again, but starting in the middle. So now this should all be 100% opaque with some transparency coming into our yellow section, which is exactly what we've got now. So if we turn on our other layers, we've got some slight opacity in here, but the full texture of our sky up top. Now we're starting to get somewhere. We're actually seeing what we want to see in our sky and our foreground elements. To blend this all a little bit more, I'm going to go inside my group layer. I'm going to create an adjustment layer for hue saturation. So within our hue saturation, we're going to select our yellows. I'm going to desaturate everything, and we're just looking for what it's desaturating. Now I want to include a little bit more of my red, so we're going to adjust our slider ever so slightly in here. Then we're going to reset that to 0. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop the saturation just a little bit so it looks more realistic, and our brightness up just a hair. Now this is all done to taste. I still think that's a bit too much, so I'm going to back off my adjustment layer to 50%. Now our lightest layer, we're going to move that now up to be our top level layer. We really just want this for bringing up some of the darkest sections of our pixels. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click and I'm going to merge visible, because I am happy with that setup. Now I just want to select the darkest of the darkest pixels. So I'm going to go to channels. I'm going to drag my RGB layer and into the selection hotspot and create a selection. If we hit Q, that will show us what it has selected. If we turn off our RGB layer, we'll see that it has selected all of our highlights. We don't want that, so I'm going to hit Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I and invert the selection, and this is going to select all of the pixels darker than 50% gray. So I'm going to save that selection as darks 1. Now the fun part, we're going to hold Command and click the darks selection channel. We're going to hold Command or Control, Option Shift, and click on it again, and this will create a new selection, which is going to be 50% of that selection. So essentially 25% of the darkest dark pixels. I'm going to save that selection. Darks 2. I'm going to keep repeating this process until I have the darkest pixels selected. So now this is darks 3, which is essentially 12.5% darks. Now if we take a look at that, everything that is white is selected. Everything that is black is deselected. So if we keep going through, select, save selection, darks 4. You can see that now we're really just getting to these really dark pixels. That's almost completely eliminated how much of our sky is selected. This is what I'm looking for right here. Everything that is white is the darkest parts in the image. So I'm going to Command click to create the selection. On our brightest layer, I'm going to go to Layer, Mask, Reveal Selection. So what we have done is we have selected all of the darkest pixels in our original image and used them as a selection to reveal the brighter image. So now all this has done is it has revealed the light image in the dark pixels on top of our darker image. So essentially giving ourselves more dynamic range in these darker pixel sets. Did we really need to do that? Well, that's a good question. You can always take this selection and create an adjustment layer using that selection. Say curves. And with this selection, you can then adjust your curves to bring up the brightness in those pixels. The risk you run, however, if you start using a selection with an adjustment layer, you are bringing up the brightness in your original image. In contrast, we revealed those sections in an image that was already brighter, meaning we are that much less likely to bring in any noise, whether it's luminosity noise or color noise, from our original image. So we're going to reveal our brighter layer using the dark selections. And now I'm going to group that. I'm going to create a layer mask on the group and hide everything. And then I don't want these brighter pixels to be revealed here in our background. I just want them to be revealed on our foreground. So we're going to create another gradient mask. And starting down here, we're going to create that mask to reveal everything from here on up. Or I'm sorry, from here on down. I'm actually going to reset that to about here. So now if we toggle it on and off, you can see it's really only adjusting these pixels down here. And that's what I wanted to see. So at this point, we can delete our curves. We can flatten this and then save it now. Okay, now that it has saved, it will have automatically sent it back to Lightroom. And so now we can see this file we're looking at right here. This is our edit.tiff. This is the one we edited in Photoshop. This one is our digital negative. This is the one that Lightroom automatically created. This is the one that we manually created in Photoshop. You can see there are similarities. One of the most notable ones, though, even if we drop our highlights all the way down, the colors got preserved a bit better in our manual HDR, with the sky specifically, and in our digital negative, it didn't preserve as much of the texture as I wanted to, and we lost, our sky kind of went green right there, and some of our pixels are still burnt out. So if we're going to, I'm going to set the color label for these. So this is our Photoshop HDR. This is our Lightroom HDR. You can see there's some very subtle differences, but for my personal preference, I like how the colors were preserved in the Photoshop versus the Lightroom HDR. High dynamic range is one of those things that we can talk about it endlessly. And it really, honestly, it just comes down to reading your negatives, reading your files, and identifying which way is going to be most effective for helping you create the final result. So, from this point, I would finish my editing in Lightroom and do all of my final adjustments. If we were to adjust our highlights, you can see we can bring even more detail, if we wanted to, into this image versus this one. This one, our highlights are brought all the way down, and it's still barely getting to the point where it's starting to look like our other image, specifically in the sky. And that's simply because it's a blend of all of the shots to get the sky. We have some of the texture and detail in this sky found within our Lightroom composite, but not all of it. In this one, we have all of the rich texture and detail from this sky because we revealed it in Photoshop using a fancy selection of masking systems. So This is a crash course in HDR, but I hope this helps you understand what your capabilities are. We will go over more advanced high dynamic range techniques in the future, but this should give you an idea of when is it appropriate to take things into Photoshop and when is it appropriate to simply leave things in Lightroom, and when do you not need HDR at all. Sometimes, like in this shot over here, we didn't need any high dynamic range techniques. We have everything we need in one shot. So why spend extra time post-processing if you don't really need to? Well, I hope that helps. If you have any further questions about HDR, feel free to shoot me an email or drop a comment below. But in a nutshell, high dynamic range is simply creating more depth into your shot by bringing detail back into your highlights and back into your shadows, and ultimately giving yourself the best workable file, whether that's in Lightroom using their automated systems, or whether that's in Photoshop or another piece of software that gives you more control over the selection and masking of the different areas of highlights and shadows within the same frame. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If there's something else you would like to see me cover in the future, again, please shoot me an email or message me through social media, or just leave a comment below. We'll catch you later.